Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined by Niall Stanage.
Always a pleasure, Amber. A Friday treat. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
How's your holiday season so far?
Busy. I'm tired.
Oh, well.
But we're getting through it.
We will get through it. We'll have lots to talk about here today.
Yes, we will. All right, ahead on Rising, the Kennedy Center Board voting Thursday to change the name of the iconic Arts Center to include Mr. Trump.
Also, why the DNC says that it's scrapping the release of its 2024 election autopsy.
And today is the day. It's the deadline for the DOJ to release the Epstein files, along with more photos from House Democrats. We'll tell you all about it, but first, after a 5-day manhunt, police say the man they believe to be the gunman in last Sunday's deadly mass shooting at Brown University has been found dead.
Police say they found the body of Claudio Manuel Neves Valente Thursday evening inside a storage unit in Salem, New Hampshire, with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police believe Valente was also behind the murder of an MIT professor soon after the Brown University shooting. Dr. Nuno Loureiro was found shot dead in his Boston area home on Tuesday morning. Here's what we know about Valente from law enforcement. He entered the US from Portugal on a student visa back in the year 2000. Prior to that, he's believed to have been a classmate of the late Dr. Loureiro while studying at a university in Lisbon, Portugal, and police say they do believe that the two men knew each other. When Valente entered the US, he was briefly enrolled at Brown for around about a semester. Police say he likely studied at the building where the shooting happened. However, there is no indication that he knew either of the students killed nor any of those injured in the shooting. In 2017, he had become a lawful permanent resident. One of the biggest breakthroughs in the case came from, of all places, Reddit, where law enforcement were directed toward a post that urged police to look into a grey Nissan with Florida plates that was spotted near the Brown campus. A day later, the author of that post apparently approached law enforcement and gave more information about a suspicious man he had seen in the bathroom of the academic building where the shooting took place, just 2 hours prior to the first gunshots.
Following Valente's death and identification, the Trump administration decided to pause the diversity lottery visa program under which they say Valente entered the United States. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem wrote in part on X, Valente entered the United States through the Diversity Lottery Immigrant Visa Program, DV1, in 2017 and was granted a green card. This heinous individual should never have been allowed in our country. At President Trump's direction, I am immediately directing USCIS to pause the DV1 program to ensure no more Americans are harmed by this disastrous program. And that seemed to have some support from conservatives online. Influencer Nick Sortor writing, "This was a lottery program that has let multiple terrorists into America, including the NYC ISIS truck ramming terrorist. Our entire immigration system needs to be scrapped and rebuilt at this point. Enough."
But Ed Krasenstein, firing back at some of the online chatter from conservatives, wrote in his own post, "Sorry to let you down, MAGA, but Claudio Manuel Neves Valente wasn't Muslim. He also didn't come into America under Biden. He also wasn't an illegal immigrant. He also wasn't transgender, but somehow MAGA still wants to blame Democrats because that's what they will always do." We can get into the politics in a second, but I mean, obviously, even though this man was found dead, I think there's relief that these crimes appear to have been solved for a start, right? There doesn't really seem to be any significant doubt that he was the person responsible for them. There had been some criticism of law enforcement because they had not appeared to be making much progress for several days, and there were people who were described as people of interest or a person of interest who proved to be entirely unrelated to this case. So now we know, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that criticism was entirely justified. The press conferences that were being given by the local police and the university officials were incredibly uninformative and seemingly unhelpful and really raised a lot of doubt of their ability to solve this case. In addition to this Reddit post, which this is a huge win for Reddit after...
You're a big Redditor yourself, right?
Well, after the Boston bombing, they actually falsely identified one of the suspects. They thought they had the guy and it was the wrong person. That person got a lot of harassment. So this is a little bit of a redemption arc for the Reddit detective class, I suppose. But there was also indication, reports late yesterday, that there were shell casings recovered at the scene that had either DNA evidence or fingerprints on them that they would hopefully be able to link to whichever suspect they eventually captured. But in the lead up to that, there weren't many breaks in the case. Police said that there weren't very many surveillance cameras. The Brown University president, 6 hours after the shooting, was grilled about her lack of knowledge about why the students were even in the classroom or what exactly happened. No one yet has been able to say what the guy shouted before he started shooting at the students. There were reports that the police apparently hadn't even interviewed all of the survivors of the shooting before yesterday. And so there was just a lot of really basic investigative tools that you would typically use that it seemed like the people in this case just completely rejected or maybe weren't experienced enough to use.
Yeah, just to circle back on a point that you mentioned about the previous Boston bombing and people being misidentified, there was in this instance as well, obviously we're not going to use the person's name, but online there was a lot of speculation about a student at Brown University who had pro-Palestinian views, and his name was put out there very widely, and he seems entirely unrelated and not remotely culpable for anything in all of this. Whether that person wants to take legal action or not will be interesting to watch, but I think it does point to the dangers of this sort of speculation just running untrammeled, naming specific individuals as potential culprits in events that they're completely innocent of.
Yeah, it was a completely irresponsible. The people who were insinuating, basically some page that he had on the Brown University website was removed, and people took that to mean that Brown was trying to get ahead of some announcement that he was involved in the shooting in some way, and there was no verification of that. And I think, unfortunately, this isn't entirely the fault of the local police and the Brown University officials, but I do think when investigators are giving so little information, and it's been 5 days, it does create the space for conspiracy theories to really thrive because people are so hungry to know what happened.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. Briefly we'll get into the immigration element of this. I mean, he did come in firstly through a student visa and then latterly the diversity lottery program. So he's not an illegal immigrant and never was, to our knowledge, unless there was some interim period where he was out of status. People who receive green cards under the diversity program do go through vetting. In this case, now this is conjecture somewhat on my part, but I'm assuming there is some level of personal enmity with the MIT professor and this guy, who obviously knew each other. I'm not sure how you vet for that. Obviously, native, people born in the United States commit heinous crimes all the time, but you may have a different view on the immigration component of this, or not.
Oh, no, I don't necessarily disagree with the vetting. I think, I've been opposed to the diversity visa lottery for some time, not just because of this shooting, and it's primarily because I believe that the legal immigration system in the U.S. should be really focused on meritocracy, and the diversity visa lottery is diametrically opposed to that. And so I think this is sort of a convenient way for people to refocus the conversation on the DV1s, because this was a question during the first Trump administration as well, where people wanted to get rid of it. And I think it was some of the president's advisors, including his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who really pushed back on that and wanted to keep it. And it was a frustration of really hardline and immigration hawks on the right.
Mm-hmm. I think one can argue, I think the diversity program one way or another, I take you at your word that you want it as a meritocracy where the needs of the country are matched to would-be immigrants. I worry sometimes, and I can't remember who it was we quoted in the intro, saying, this proves that the immigration system has to be begun from scratch again. I wonder if those people actually want immigration at all, and that's why I wonder, do those impulses come from just an anti-immigrant blanket position, which obviously, for obvious reasons, I wouldn't agree with.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of elements of the right calling for an immigration moratorium, and the debate that's happening among conservatives is how long would that last and is it necessary? I think there's good arguments around it, but, obviously we don't have time to get into that today.
Sure, absolutely.
Next up on Rising, the Kennedy Center has been renamed to include President Trump. We'll tell you more next. The Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts voted Thursday to rename the building as the Trump Kennedy Center. At an Oval Office event on Thursday, President Trump gave his reaction to the vote.
I was honored by it. The board is a very distinguished board, most distinguished people in the country. And I was surprised by it. I was honored by it. You know, we're saving the building. We saved the building. The building was in such bad shape, both physically, financially, and every other way. And now it's very solid, very strong.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt congratulated Trump, writing on X, "I have just been informed that the highly respected board of the Kennedy Center, some of the most successful people from all parts of the world, have just voted unanimously to rename the Kennedy Center to the Trump Kennedy Center because of the unbelievable work President Trump has done."
This move did raise legal concerns, however, as to whether the board has the authority to rename the arts institution, which was designated by Congress in 1964. President John F. Kennedy's niece, Maria Shriver, criticized the move, writing on X, "It is beyond comprehension that the sitting president has sought to rename this great memorial dedicated to President Kennedy. It is beyond wild that he would think adding his name in front of President Kennedy's name is acceptable. It is not. Next thing, perhaps he will want to rename JFK Airport, rename the Lincoln Memorial, the Trump Lincoln Memorial, the Trump Jefferson Memorial, the Trump Smithsonian. The list goes on. Can we not see what is happening here? Come on, my fellow Americans, wake up. This is not dignified. This is not funny."
By Thursday afternoon, the center's website header was updated to say the Trump Kennedy Center.
The action left many Democrats fuming. Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, an ex officio member of the board, said the vote wasn't unanimous. Let's listen.
I am bringing this to you live today because what you may hear is that there was a unanimous vote to rename the Kennedy Center the Trump Center. Be clear, I was on that call, and as I tried to push my button to voice my concern, to ask questions, and certainly not to vote in support of this, I was muted. Each time I tried to speak, I was muted. Participants were not allowed to voice their concerns who were online.
And here is House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries also slamming the decision.
The so-called Kennedy Center board wants to rename the Kennedy Center after Donald Trump. Are you kidding me? Like, how does that help deal with the affordability crisis in this country?
I'm not really surprised to see Hakeem Jeffries seizing on that point. I think, from in terms of the politics of it, I find it an absurd decision for reasons we'll get into. But in terms of the politics of it, it does give Democrats more ammunition to argue that Trump is more focused on his own aggrandizement and on his own ego than he is on resolving issues that face people in their daily lives. I think that's where the political weakness or vulnerability of it lies. I find the thing itself kind of ridiculous and part of Trump's ongoing insecurity, as I would see it, of him constantly trying to rename things after himself or lift himself up. We had the Trump Institute of Peace recently. There's controversy of a different kind around this, the Walk of Fame or whatever it's called in the White House, which now has all these plaques mocking President Biden, President Obama, various others. So kind of a ridiculous move, but with some potential political ramifications, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's silly and a distraction. I actually think the Kennedy Center has been doing really great work under Rick Grinnell, which is why this is annoying, because they've been refocusing a lot of the programming on classical music and fine art and also popular shows like The Sound of Music. And they've had some really great events that have broken attendance records, and they've been selling a lot of tickets. And I think that's wonderful. Then you throw Trump's name on it, and all of a sudden it's less about trying to actually reform the center to appeal to a wider swath of Americans. And it becomes, again, another thing that's trying to cement the Trump legacy or make it about the president himself. And it seems so unnecessary to me. And I wrote about this in my newsletter earlier this week, about the plaques on the Walk of Fame, or the Presidential Walk of Fame, whatever it's called, which is that I think even Trump supporters are fine with these sort of trolling, cry more liberals kind of moves when there's a lot of accomplishments happening, but there haven't been many major moves in the past few months. I mean, there's been the DOJ coming out and saying they're not going to pursue cases that have disparate impact liability anymore under civil rights law, which I think is a huge win. But outside of that, there's been a lot of calls for the president to focus his attention on domestic politics, to tackle the affordability crisis, and to take Americans' concerns seriously. And instead, he's been calling it a hoax and basically saying the economy is A+++++. Everybody knows that it's not. And so you can't get away with this trolling, everything's named after Trump and gold now when you're not handling the basics.
I agree with that. And in fact, just yesterday on the show, I was talking in a different context about some of the polling that shows that people now believe that the economy, for example, that Trump is much more primarily responsible for the economy than former President Biden, who Trump
because he's been so defensive about it.
Right, exactly, and he's making all those arguments. And this was a Fox News poll that also showed many more people believe they have been hurt by Trump's economic policies than have been helped by them. So I think that is obviously a problem. On the point of the Kennedy Center, I do agree that putting his name on it puts off probably a significant number of its existing client base, and the bet is that they can increase attendance from other quarters. There was a report in the Washington Post a while back, which I know Rick Vinnell disputed pretty vigorously. The Post's report was that ticket sales had fallen by 43%. Now, there may be more individual shows within that do have a wider appeal. I have been to the Kennedy Center a very small number of times in my life, all predating the Trump presidency. My basic assumption is that the demographic from which its most frequent clients are drawn is not a Trump supporting demographic,
no,
to say the very least. So to see, I think that could have some ramifications.
Yeah,
there.
so I'm a regular patron. My husband grew up on classical music. His mom was a trained classical pianist, and so he's kind of been getting me into this music and these shows, and it's really wonderful. We're seeing Handel's Messiah on Sunday, actually, overall, the Kennedy Center hasn't changed that much. And so I think it is a shame when people boycott just because, the Trump administration is involved now. One thing they did add is they added a speakeasy, which I think is really cool because for people who have been to a show, after the show's over, the Kennedy Center totally clears out. It's empty, it's dead, and it's got a really weird vibe. And so they're trying to get people to hang around and enjoy a drink after the show and meet people, which I think is awesome. And again, I just think those things that are sort of common sense and actually business-wise really smart for trying to bring money in are now being distracted from because of this.
Fair enough. Well, bring us your review of Handel's Messiah.
I will.
The next time you're on. Up next, Trump administration officials are making moves to ban gender-affirming care for minors. Don't go anywhere. We'll come back with that. Health officials from the Trump administration announced new rules on Thursday intended to end gender-related care for minors at hospitals across the country. One of the orders threatens to pull funding from any hospital that provided gender treatments for minors.
The first prohibits doctors and hospitals from receiving federal Medicaid reimbursement for gender care provided to transgender patients younger than age 18. The second blocks all Medicaid and Medicare funding for any services at hospitals that provide pediatric, quote-unquote, gender-affirming care. If finalized, the new rules would shut down hospitals that fail to comply.
Here were Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Medicare and Medicaid leader Dr. Mehmet Oz speaking yesterday.
So-called gender-affirming care has inflicted lasting physical and psychological damage on vulnerable young people. This is not medicine, it is malpractice. We're done with junk science driven by ideological pursuits, not the well-being of children.
We want our hospitals returning to healing, not harming the patients entrusted with their care, or they're going to pay a very steep price.
The American Academy of Pediatrics pushed back against the administration. AAP President Dr. Susan J. Cressley said, "These policies and proposals misconstrue the current medical consensus and fail to reflect the realities of pediatric care and the needs of children and families." is I mean, I'm always slightly uneasy talking about the trans issue because basically I think that there are advocates on each side who are very zealous, I would say, and there is a lot of evidence that seems to me to be mixed. I mean, to summarize very briefly, there's a British report last year that suggested that the medical route was not the best pathway for many adolescents who are troubled by these issues. And then you have the American Medical Association and that Pediatrics Association that we're talking about saying, no, it is, it genuinely brings down things like suicidal ideation with people with gender dysmorphia issues. I would assume you would have a more firmly anti-view, but maybe you wouldn't.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of the studies that are relied upon by organizations like the AMA were very poorly designed, which is why the CAS review that you're referencing in Great Britain was so important. For example, one of the studies they use is actually a self-report study, and it included individuals who it would have been impossible for them to have received so-called gender-affirming care when they were minors because it either didn't exist then or they started transitioning after, but it's lumped into this giant study to suggest that they were better off after receiving gender-affirming care as a minor. It basically it refutes itself. That's one of the major ones, and there's a couple of others that unfortunately we don't have time to get fully into. But this is an extension of an executive order that Trump signed at the beginning of the administration that threatened to pull federal funding from hospitals that did provide I call them sex changes for minor. I don't use the phrase gender affirming care if I can help it because I think it's more of a euphemism than anything else. But I'm firmly in favor of this. I think this is a fantastic move. There was a review also done by the HHS over the summer where a variety of medical professionals met, reviewed basically all of the currently available studies, and determined that the potential harms of these treatments, as they call them, do outweigh the potential benefits, and the better path forward is to focus on either behavioral therapy, talk therapy, etc. And it turned out that some of those people, they were originally anonymous. Some of them came forward and wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said, we are actually liberal. People were criticizing us. They accused Trump of basically handpicking people who would agree with his preferred conclusion. We were liberal. We went into this with an open mind and actually discovered that the evidence points against the widely accepted standard by the medical professional community in the United States. And so that's why we reached the conclusion that we did.
Let me get in very briefly, just in terms of where I see the difficulty for someone like myself who's slightly kind of moderate or in the middle in this issue. The Trump administration, on the one hand, wants people to report if hospitals are carrying out mastectomies on minors. That, I mean, you would need to convince me very hard that a mastectomy for a minor on those grounds was necessary. Now, whether people should report it or not is a different question. That's difficult to persuade me of. They're also trying to ban, though, breast-binding garments. Is that really a long-term eternal wrongdoing? I mean, I find it very difficult to believe that that's causing people lifetime harm.
Yeah, I wish I could respond.
I know.
Unfortunately, we got to go.
Yeah.
All right, many Democrats are upset after the Democratic National Committee said it will not be releasing its extensive report detailing what went wrong in the 2024 election. Stick around. The Democratic National Committee is scrapping the release of its autopsy of the 2024 election. DNC Chairman Ken Martin ordered the report months ago to dissect what went wrong for Democrats last year.
According to a DNC official, the analysis was based on hundreds of interviews conducted over several months. But now Martin believes it's best for the party to keep the report private. In a statement shared with The Hill, Martin says, quote, "In our conversations with stakeholders from across the democratic ecosystem, we are aligned on what's important, and that's learning from the past and winning the future. Here's our North Star," he says. "Does this help us win? If the answer is no, it's a distraction from the core mission."
Instead, Dems will look to build on their momentum after winning several key races in 2025 and try to take back power in Congress in next year's midterms. According to people familiar with the report, there was some contention among Democratic leaders over what it would and would not discuss. A New York Times article published in July says the report was expected to skirt around tough questions regarding Joe Biden's decision to run for re-election and whether Kamala Harris was the right person to replace him once he dropped out.
Some people, like former DNC advisor Daniel Wesser, supported the withholding of the report. He told the New York Times, quote, "Haven't we rehashed 2024 enough? We just won a bunch of elections this year. There is also a lot of good to be learned from there."
But online, many Democrats were upset and disgruntled by the news. Pod Save America host and former Obama speechwriter Jon Favreau writing on X, "Unreal. The DNC's actual position is that if the public knew more about what Democrats got wrong in the last election, it would hurt the party's chances in the next election. How does this rebuild trust between the party insiders and grassroots activists and organizers? Why does the party only trust people with the truth who are part of their insular club? And why on earth would the DNC think that keeping their promise to release the report would create more of a backlash than announcing that they're keeping it secret? Baffling."
And former DNC Vice Chair David Hogg says, "I ran for DNC Vice Chair after massive losses in 2024 because I believed we needed to change our party. Leadership disagreed with my work to primary asleep at the wheel incumbents and challenge the status quo. Now they are spiking an autopsy of the election that gave us Trump 2.0. Well, I'm kind of aligned with the David Hogg, Jon Favreau wing, as you might imagine there, Amber.
I agree. Yeah. I think that point about rebuilding trust is really important because, okay, the report's being suppressed, which means it's only being shared with a select number of party leaders, which means the really presumably important conclusions are not being communicated to a wider swath of the party or the party's activists, which means they're not getting the important intel that they need in order to course correct after 2024. And sure, they can say, well, we just won this, these special elections and these off-year elections, but what's stopping them now from reverting back to the policy positions or the messaging that cost them so dearly in the presidential?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely correct point. There are a lot of people who are left of centre on the political spectrum who have enormous frustrations with the DNC and have done for a long time. I mean, going way back to like 2016, they put a thumb on the scale to help Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders, for example. Here, it's just another example of what I think is frankly a very dumb decision, as well as one that is likely to sow the kind of distrust that you mentioned. Firstly, my assumption is that this report will leak anyway, so they've just created a kind of kerfuffle for no good effect. And then the information that they did release, and this goes directly to your point, was the most kind of anodyne stuff imaginable. In the statement from which we quoted, they went on to talk about things like we really should listen to voters better. Now, there was also some suggestion that like peer-to-peer texting wasn't as effective as they'd hoped, or that when they were going around knocking on doors, they'd focused on quantity over quality and that kind of engagement. But all of those things are very vanilla, and they avoid what I think are certainly two of the biggest issues that face Democrats after the last election. One is the extent to which the whole Gaza issue played into Democratic dissatisfaction. We could get into that. But the other point is Kamala Harris's campaign spent about $1.5 billion in 15 weeks. Are there people who got a good chunk of that money who don't want to answer hard questions about it, or don't want their role looked at in a more heavily scrutinized way? It seems on its face like the answer to that is likely to be yes, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I think so. And also the lack of inclusion of Biden running for re-election and how long it took Democratic power brokers to finally force him out of the race. Also, Kamala Harris focusing a lot of her campaign on celebrity endorsements and these big rallies featuring people like Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, which frankly don't really appeal to the people in swing states that they really needed to win.
No criticism, no Cardi B slander in my case.
Look, I don't have anything against the woman. I just, our voters worried about affordability in Pennsylvania, really excited about Cardi B. No, probably not. And I think also this point about the decision to not release the report ends up becoming a bigger headline than the report itself, because now they're giving the impression that they have something to hide. And I'm also curious about what the interviews were. They said they did hundreds of interviews. With whom, right? Was it with members of the party? Was it with voters? Was it with consultants? I think that alone would be really instructive as to how useful this report actually is. And to your point, this question of, or the anodyne release of details like, our text campaign didn't work that well. I could have told you that in October of 2024 because I was getting texts from the DNC asking me to go knock doors for Kamala Harris. Sorry, but if I'm getting texts from you to go knock doors for Kamala Harris, I think your microtargeting campaign really sucks.
I was going to say, if they were doing one of those like five-point gauges for how supportive people are likely to be, I don't think I would have you listed as the most likely Kamala Harris.
I mean, I guess
candidature.
what I think happened is and I've been saying this for a while, but when I talk to Democratic consultants versus Republican consultants, what they say the primary differences between their targeting campaigns is that the Democrats really focus on demographics, whereas Republicans focus on things like media consumption, lifestyle habits, etc. And also like socioeconomic status. But they probably saw, white 30-something woman in Northern Virginia, gotta be a Democrat, right? Also works in media.
Yeah.
Whereas the Republicans are actually looking at voting history, attends church regularly,
Sure.
and
What TV shows you watch or
right,
whatever.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think they rely on a very basic and old-fashioned method of looking at voter patterns as opposed to more specific data.
The other point in the arguments that are being made about this report that I think is important, and where I think the DNC's position is kind of nonsensical, is this idea that, well, we just won 2 or 3 big elections this year, so we shouldn't go back then to 2024. And it's like, no, just as a basic empirical idea, you look at what works, which is whether it's Mamdani or Mikey Sherrill or whoever, it doesn't really matter, and then you go back and look at what doesn't work,
Right.
and you're like, what are the differences between these two things? One shouldn't disqualify the other. I find that a very, very bizarre idea. Anyway, today is the deadline for the long-awaited release of the Epstein files. Coming up, why some have suggested the files may not be as transparent as many Americans would hope. Stay with us. Friday is the deadline for the Justice Department to publicly release the Jeffrey Epstein files. This deadline was set by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which was passed nearly unanimously by both the House and the Senate 1 month ago.
But with the deadline here, CNN is reporting that the DOJ is working to redact thousands of pages of files before they're officially released. CNN's article on the matter says a substantial number of redactions are needed. Quote, the documents each attorney is processing since Thanksgiving week can number more than 1,000, a time-consuming task that likely will come down to the wire. The sensitivities of executive and legal privacy, victims' protections, and other concerns all could play into the choices that lawyers must make when it comes to potential redactions. It continues, quote, the situation suggests that the persistent political headache connected to transparency for the Epstein files may not disappear with Friday's deadline. In whatever becomes public on Friday, sources said there will still be extensive amounts of information redacted, the type of lack of transparency that the American public may continue to scrutinize.
Congressman Khanna, one of the primary sponsors of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, posted a video on Thursday reminding the DOJ that the documents should be as transparent as possible, and he threatened prosecution if the redactions are found to be excessive. Take a look.
Let me be very clear. We need a full release. Anyone who tampers with these documents or conceals documents or engages in excessive redaction will be prosecuted because of obstruction of justice. We will prosecute individuals regardless of whether they're the Attorney General or a career or political appointee. We need full transparency and justice for the survivors.
Meanwhile, House Democrats on the Oversight Committee released another small batch of photos ahead of Friday's deadline. 2 of the photos show Epstein with several women whose faces were redacted, as well as one of Microsoft founder Bill Gates posing with an unknown woman. It's not clear when these photos were taken or where. There's also this screenshot of text messages. It reads in part, I have a friend, Scout. She sent me some girls today, but she asks $1,000 per girl. I will send you girls now. Maybe someone will be good for Jay. Again, it's unknown who sent the messages or whom they were sent to.
The New York Times, meanwhile, released its own article on Thursday, taking a deep dive into President Trump's relationship with Epstein. The New York Times clarifies it has found no evidence implicating Trump in Epstein's abuse and trafficking of minors. But the article still alleges that Trump was closer with Epstein than he's let on, and that the two bonded over their pursuit of women. It reads in part, quote, "Beginning in the late 1980s, the two men forged a bond intense enough to leave others who knew them with the impression that they were each other's closest friend," the Times found. "Neither man drank or did drugs. They pursued women in a game of ego and dominance. Female bodies were currency." The Times goes on, "Over nearly 2 decades, as Mr. Trump cut a swathe through the party circuits of New York and Florida, Mr. Epstein was perhaps his most reliable wingman." Well, I guess we should start with the release of the documents. I mean, I think it's welcome that these are going to be released. I think the greater level of release, that is important. Obviously, we don't want victims identified. We don't want people's privacy breached in that way. But there's enormous public curiosity about this. I think some of the theories around Epstein may ultimately prove overblown, but he was a very powerful man who was a very wide-scale predator who got off very leniently the first time around and of course never ultimately faced justice because he took his own life the second time around.
Yeah, and the DOJ could have avoided actually a lot of the curiosity if they had not slow-walked the release of these documents and forced Congress to pass this resolution. Republicans have tried to sort of weasel out of that by having James Comer on the Oversight Committee be doing these intermittent document drops to kind of provide cover for the Trump administration. But the reality is this was promised by people in and around the Trump campaign while they were running in 2024 that they were going to get to the bottom of this, and then they completely changed tack once they got into office, which has, of course, naturally raised speculation that there is something in there that Trump doesn't want released. I mean, that's just the natural conclusion that you would reach from someone immediately changing their tune on this issue. I also do want to say that I think the Democrats have done a few releases that have actually hurt their argument in regards to the Trump administration. And I'm going to pick on Jasmine Crockett for a second.
Oh, no.
I know you're something of a fan, but she has been responsible for 2, I think, pretty big headaches related to the Epstein files for the Democrats. The first was after the Democrats released that email from Jeffrey Epstein insinuating that Trump had met one of the victims. They had redacted the victim's name, and it turned out to be Virginia Giuffre, who had publicly said numerous times that she never saw Trump do anything untoward with any of the victims. And Jasmine Crockett did a CNN appearance where she was asked about why was the name redacted. And she said, well, I don't know why Republicans would redact the name. You'd have to ask them. Well, to Jasmine Crockett, it was the Democrats who redacted. And she goes, well, I don't know anything about that. And then later on, she publicly insinuated that Trump cabinet official Lee Zeldin had received donations from Jeffrey Epstein, and it turned out to be an entirely different Jeffrey Epstein, who's a doctor in New York. And then the most recent release from the Democrats prior to this latest batch of photos had Trump with a group of women whose faces were blurred out. And so there was all of this speculation about who those women might be. And it turned out they were all, of age models who were like public figures. So I think that hurts their cause of trying to tie this to Trump if they do a release and then it turns out that the unredacted version of the release is far less damning than they insinuated.
The one of those examples that you said that I have most knowledge of was the naming of the other Jeffrey Epstein without saying it was another Jeffrey Epstein. And I would agree with you on that one, actually, much as I would defend Jasmine Crockett more broadly, because I think a lot of the criticism of her is unfair. That was not a good moment. That was one of those too clever by half things where you're being disingenuous and it doesn't benefit anything. To your earlier point about Republicans, I do think that a lot of the political negativity for this for Republicans in the Trump administration is of their own making. Yes. Because, there's Pam Bondi and the list's on her desk, it's about to be released, and then, oh, no, there isn't a list. It even came up in the Susie Wiles interview this week that has become controversial. So a lot of that is, I think, a problem or damage that they have inflicted upon themselves. Now, the Times story that we referenced in the introduction was very long and had some somewhat interesting details, but had no real bombshell attached to it. And was they'd obviously spent a lot of time going through these things. And to their credit, fairly high up the story, they did note that thing that it did not suggest or imply that Trump was involved in anything untoward. There was no real new information that came out of it. Will there be information in the files that are released? That obviously is the key question. There was a lot of speculation that time the email came out from Epstein to the author Michael Wolff, where he talked about Trump. Of course he knew about the girls because he told Ghislaine to stop. Again, that message exists in isolation. It's a pretty ominous message, but we would prefer to see the full context.
Yes, I agree with your assessment of the New York Times story. It's a story of color, right? It's trying to sort of define his relationship with Epstein, but the reality is the details in it are telling us what we already know. Trump was a dog with women. Not surprising, right? We all know this. And they had some kind of falling out in the early to mid 2000s. And this is just sort of providing more context to that relationship. They also released another story, though, earlier this week that I thought was interesting, which will certainly not dampen the appetite for this big bombshell, but it was a story about Jeffrey Epstein's financial history and basically how he got wealthy. And there's been this theory that he was perhaps blackmailing clients of his who were using these underage girls, and that was how he got them to invest their money with him. And the Times story suggests something far less nefarious, which is just that he was really good at convincing people to give him money even before perhaps the sex trafficking ring started. Who knows if that's really what happened or not. The documents, hopefully, the files will help us suss that out. But I think regardless of what drops, there's going to be immense dissatisfaction among the American public unless like Trump and Bill Clinton are going to jail, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, there's an insatiable appetite for more and more information. But I do think that hopefully the release of more documents will at least allow people to clarify to some extent what is going on here, including on the financial side, which is the subject of a lot of interest and intrigue. Meanwhile, the woman who was caught on the kiss cam at a Coldplay concert earlier this year is finally speaking out. Oh joy. We'll be right back after this. Kristen Cabot, who got caught on a Coldplay kiss cam with her boss, has finally spoken up about the sensationally viral video. The former HR executive, Cabot, and the ex-astronomer CEO, Andy Byron, were caught in an intimate embrace during a Coldplay concert in Boston. Let's rewatch the clip.
Yeah. Oh, look at these two. All right, come on. You're okay? Oh, what? Either they're having an affair or they're just very shy.
After remaining silent for months, Cabot finally addressed the matter in an interview with the New York Times. Thank God. Cabot said, "I made a bad decision and had a couple of high noons and danced and acted inappropriately with my boss. It's not nothing. I took accountability and I gave up my career for that. That's the price I chose to pay." Wow, she's a hero. Cabot admitted that Byron was her, quote, big happy crush in the New York Times article with the title, "The Ritual Shaming of the Woman at the Coldplay Concert." Cabot said, "I was so embarrassed and so horrified, but I'm not some celebrity. Even if I did have an affair, it's not anybody's business. It has been like a scarlet letter. People erased everything I'd accomplished in my life and achieved in my career. This can't be the final word."
The article notes that the company Astronomer declined to comment on the matter. Cabot, on the other hand, says she received at least 500 or 600 calls a day, harassing her afterwards, that the paparazzi came after her like a parade, while she also received death threats. Well, I suspect you sound a bit skeptical of this move.
I am very skeptical. Look, nobody wants death threats. The paparazzi harassing are totally unnecessary.
Right.
But, I mean, she suggests in the article that basically the scrutiny came from the fact that she is a woman and it's based on misogyny. No, this is a character issue. The guy was just as nasty as she was. They were both married. Like, let's be real. Y'all went viral because you were obviously engaging in inappropriate behavior in a very public venue and people called you out for it. And I just think this sort of like woe is me, victimization, self-victimization is pretty ridiculous. I do take the point, she had a few high noons, whomst among us. But there was this hilarious tweet from Jarvis I want to read because he kind of predicted this. He wrote this in earlier December. "My favorite thing ever is when the New York Times does a profile on a lib that did something bad and needs an image boost. they always have two pictures. The first has the subject in their house wearing a sweater and looking out a closed window. This creates the impression that they are hiding from the mob and just want to be left alone. The second picture has the subject walking in a park or garden looking pensive, as if to suggest that they will bravely push through their fear and ultimately triumph over the bad guys. And sure enough, and I wish we had the photos, two of them from the profile had her pensively looking out a window.
Yes, there we can we get a close up on this?
Here we go. And then the other one defiantly in the garden.
There we go.
In the sweater. Amazing.
It is very, very classic New York Times. So let me speak up firstly and to give a more permissive view of people's personal behaviour. I don't really particularly care what consenting adults do in their lives. She was separated, though not divorced, from her husband at the time. The guy, I think, I'm not quite sure, had some sort of marital issues, and I'm sure they were exacerbated by what happened. I think it was just this thing where people were amused by the whole scenario. It was kind of funny. Where I have more common ground with you is I'm kind of skeptical of people who give interviews to the New York Times about how much they dislike the public scrutiny that is upon them. And she has also hired, the article makes clear, a communications consultant to work with her on this. You know, look, people shouldn't be harassed or receive death threats, obviously. But the idea of a sort of a, woe is me, this is horrendous to be in the public eye, and here's my big spread in the New York Times, that seems a bit hard to take.
There was a similar thing that happened when the pop singer Ariana Grande was found to be having an affair with the guy who played SpongeBob on Broadway. He had a newborn baby with his wife, and they were filming Wicked together in Europe and engaged in an affair, and it broke up his marriage. And Ariana Grande claims she was already getting a divorce, but who knows the timing on that. But it was similar where like her and her fans were basically insinuating that she was being hyper scrutinized because she's a woman and people just don't like women. And to me, it's like, yes, it's so obvious that the guy who was married and had this newborn child was wrong that I think people naturally go to the affair partner who chose to engage in that relationship because, in my opinion, I actually think we give too much of a pass to people who engage with people who they know are married.
When they're single.
Like, I think both of those people have a responsibility to stay away from those inappropriate relationships. And for some reason, we just kind of like excuse the affair partner.
I wish we had more time to talk about this.
I know, right? But that's going to do it for us on Rising Live. Look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.